want to finish, and
Yeah,
we will
yeah.
finish.
Okay.
So today we are the special guest from Ireland, comrade Marxist Paul. Hello.
Hello, comrade. Thank you very much for having me. It's nice to be here.
So comrade Paul is the author of a very popular channel where you can find professional videos presenting the Marxist theory in a simple and accessible way. My first question concerns Ireland. On my channel, I recently published an audiobook with the first volume of Karl Marx Capital. In Capital, there is a section on capitalist accumulation and a section on Ireland. Ireland was a victim of a British imperialism and Ireland population plummeted. In Poland, most people have not heard about it at all, and it seems to them that imperialist barbarism was only in Africa and other European colonies, and it concerned people of a different skin color due to their civilizational inferiority. Can you tell about the tragedy of your nation and how the white Christians of Ireland were treated so badly by the British bourgeoisie?
Okay, strap in. Thank you very much. This is a long. There's a very long answer to this. It's an over 800-year long history, um, and it's bad. It's real bad. So it's interesting the way this is framed is with regard to skin color. That's generally how we perceive this particular question. We generally perceive it along racial lines. You've got like white colonizers and non-white colonized, indigenous or native people and stuff like that. So, you know, it is important to remember that regarding skin color, the way we understand whiteness today, that's a product entirely of European colonialism. The colonizers racialized those who they were colonizing as part of their ideological justification for the looting and plundering of these territories. So if you look back historically, you can actually find a very similar process of racialization of the Irish people occurring throughout the centuries as part of the English justification for their genocidal actions in this country. And just a note on that, this has been going on for a very, very long time. But back before Britain even existed, this was the English. Of course. And now we talk about the UK, but originally it was England, then Britain, then the United Kingdom, and colonialism and colonial exploitation and destruction has been unfortunately a constant feature throughout. So from the very beginning, with the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169, the colonization of Ireland was explicitly viewed in racialized terms. For example, Gerald of Wales, one of the main Norman families involved in the early conquest of Ireland, who was a royal clerk and chaplain to King Henry II, who headed the conquests, he described the Irish people as a filthy people wallowing in vice. He condemned their supposed, in his words, laziness, treachery, blasphemy, idolatry, ignorance of Christian beliefs, as well as yeah, and this is the thing he did, as well as accusing us of incest and cannibalism. So that was a lovely characterization. So we, as the natives of Ireland, we were deemed to be an inferior race. They explicitly used that term, race. And this continued. This continued with the colonial process as it intensified in the 1500s. So Edmund Spencer, you might know from like the Canterbury Tales and stuff. Edmund Spencer wrote of the English coming to Ireland and supposedly degenerating to mere Irish. So there was a concern that if English people went to Ireland, they would degenerate and become Irish. They would become turncoats. They would, quote, go native. And this was, of course, we were this inferior species, according to this worldview. Sir John Davies described us as lazy and unreliable, that we had terrible diets and bad table manners, that we were uncouth or barbaric in general, uncivilized, as they say. One of the funny ways they characterize us, so this is kind of comedic. We were condemned for our hairstyles, if you believe that. Okay, it was very popular in Ireland to have what was called a glib. A glib was a very long fringe and generally short on the back. Kind of like the Beatles, like the Beatles have this this kind of fringe. But this was long before the Beatles made it acceptable for men to have these haircuts, and this was again something that was racialized against us. And actually, interesting as time went on, one of the ways the British would mark their sort of colonial conquests in Ireland was that they would actually shave the heads of men and women in particular, in Ireland. So that was a pretty horrific thing to do. So moving forward then to the Protestant Reformation in England, from that point on, the category of racialization changed from native Irish to Irish Catholic. So from the 1500s onwards, the language moves away from the settler and the native, or the colonizer and colonized. From the Protestant Reformation in England onwards, the Irish Catholic, the degenerate race, that's how they were referring to us. But we almost, we have to always remember that the Irish Catholic was always an ethnic category. It was a placeholder for native, indigenous, or colonized. Okay, unlike with the colonized in Latin America and Africa and so on, the English couldn't use the tone of our skin as a signifier for our supposedly lesser status. So rather than racializing us as black or Indian and so on, they used Catholic as the placeholder for the colonized identity. But it functioned the very same way as part of the ideological justification for their genocidal activities. Now, I know you wanted to ask some questions about the genocidal activities throughout the ages. As for these genocidal activities, the most immediate things that probably come to mind in sort of recent memory, and by recent memory, I don't mean my recent memory, I mean the general national recent memory of about the past 100 years or so. We can think of the Bloody Sundays, for example, that occurred. Come to mind first, the Croke Park massacre in 1920, where British soldiers opened fire on civilians at a Gaelic football match in Croke Park, Dublin, murdering 14 unarmed citizens and injuring 80 more. As well, there was another Bloody Sunday, or the Bogside Massacre of 1972 in Derry. That's part of the occupied Six Counties, so-called Northern Ireland, where British soldiers, they shot 26 unarmed civilians who had been attending a peaceful civil rights demonstration, and they killed 13 of them immediately, with a further deaths 4 months later as a result of the injuries that he'd endured in the shooting. We also might refer to the fascist loyalist paramilitaries colluding with the British state in the 70s and the 80s to terrorize and assassinate both revolutionary Republicans as well as unarmed native civilians, particularly but not exclusively in the occupied Six Counties during the period known internationally as the so-called Troubles. But in truth, as you can probably tell from the conversation so far, this violence has been going on for over 800 years. There's been over 800 years of colonial onslaught, dispossession, displacement, starvation, full-on genocide of the most brutal and barbaric forms imaginable. Ireland functioned as a kind of testing ground or a petri dish for European colonial terror that would later be exported abroad. So the first 400 years of colonization, beginning in the mid 1100s, they were barbaric, but they weren't fully successful. Ireland was actually only brought under complete colonial domination in the early 1600s, early to mid 1600s. And this was largely due to A, a massive increase in colonial state terrorism in the 1500s, and B, the development of settler colonialism, where people from England, Scotland, and Wales were sent over to Ireland on plantations or settlements to literally replace the native population and guarantee loyalty to the English crown. Because as I mentioned earlier, there was always this concern that when they sent people over, whether they were soldiers or whoever they might be, they would assimilate to Ireland. They would become Irish in a way, So there was a constant concern that the English would become Irish, this degenerate race that we are, this was a big concern. They realized they wanted it to be the opposite way around. They wanted the Irish to become English if they could, and if they couldn't, then they wanted the Irish gone. They wanted the Irish just dead, and that's an unfortunate reality that unraveled, especially throughout the 1500s and into the 1600s, and then of course moving forward into the famine and stuff. Regarding the violence in the 1500s, that stands out would be the 1575 massacre of the entire civilian population of Rathlin Island, just off the coast of the north of Ireland, led by the English Sir Francis Drake. That was over 600 civilians, unarmed civilians, just slaughtered, literally just massacred. So they wiped out the entire island. But this violence was widespread and brutal throughout the country and carefully planned by English administrators. For example, Sir Humphrey Gilbert ordered, and this is horrific, Sir Humphrey Gilbert ordered that the heads of all those which were killed during the day should be cut off from their bodies and brought to the place where they encamped at night. and so that the heads should be laid at the ground by each side of the pathway leading into the tents, so that anybody who visited those tents trying to find, their former comrades, their friends, whoever it might be, they would be greeted by their heads, their decapitated, severed heads, literally removed from bodies, And he boasted about this. He said, "Yet did it bring great terror to the people when they saw the heads of their dead fathers, brothers, children, kinsfolk, and friends lie on the ground before their faces as they came to speak with them." So it was absolutely horrific. They were slaughtering everybody, women, children, everyone. And then after they slaughtered them, they would cut off their heads and place them around their homes, their dwellings where they lived, in order to instill terror and fear amongst anybody who would try to visit these people, the newly dead people. They didn't exclusively use open brutal force, nor these terroristic fear methods either. They implemented what's called a scorched earth policy. As the English Charles Blunt, the Lord Deputy of Ireland at that time, stated, "Our only way to ruin the rebels must be to make all possible waste of the means for life." Now, this meant destroying the land, destroying its flora, its fauna, polluting the water, and making the country completely uninhabitable. This caused huge amounts of famine across the country. Now, in a later letter writing of this policy's success, the same English Charles Blunt described the results. And he wrote, "We found everywhere men dead of famine. Between Tullagogue and Toome, there lay unburied 1,000 dead. There were 3,000 starved in Tyrone. No spectacle was more frequent in the ditches of towns, and especially in wasted counties, than to see the multitudes of these people dead with their mouths all coloured green by eating nettles, docks, and all things they could rend up above the ground." So there was nothing edible. There was no food, nor like natural food that a person would eat. And so they were so desperate that they were eating all of these, if you know what nettles are, if you know what docks are, they're poisonous. They're poisonous leaves that you can't eat. And so everywhere in the country you'd go, you'd find these dead bodies, and their mouths were green from just trying to eat things that people can't survive on, So this was really horrific stuff, and unfortunately it got worse under Oliver Cromwell. We call him the Butcher in Ireland. He's known as the Butcher. Of particular note would be the Siege of Drogheda in September 1649, where 2,000 Irish defenders were killed, as well as 1,000 unarmed civilians, women, children. And these kinds of massacres were widespread, really starting in 1649. Cromwell's genocidal conquest led to approximately half of the Irish population being wiped out. So in about a decade, the population of Ireland dropped from 1.5 million people to 850,000 people in 1657. And it's important to know, of the 850,000 people that were there, 150,000 of those were settlers from England and Scotland. So the Irish natives would have been 700,000 or less, depending on the settlers who came beforehand. Speaking of genocide, and jumping forward now historically, the big one, which I think a lot of people may have heard of, and that really needs to be addressed, is of course what's called the Great Famine. In Ireland, we call that An Gorta Mór. That's in Irish, in Gaelic, in Gaeilge. The Great Famine, which lasted from 1845 to 1852, where 1 million people died and a further million were forced to leave the country, wiping out 25% of the population of Ireland. Now, it's important to remember that there was actually no food shortage in Ireland at the time. Okay, we talk about a famine and people just think, oh well, there was no food, so what are you going to do? No, there was no food shortage. There was more than enough beef and grain and everything else you can imagine that you'd want to eat. There was more than enough to go around and to feed everybody. But of course, rather than feeding the people, the Brits, who were directly in charge of Ireland at this stage, it was under direct rule. The Brits were exporting that food rather than feeding the people in Ireland. They were exporting that food out of Ireland. Now, the Irish peasants had been robbed of most of our lands and our means of life through the penal laws. They'd taken away penal as in penalty laws. And this particularly targeted Catholics, Irish Catholics, again, natives or the colonized people. And this left us with basically no land. We only had tiny little patches of land that were only suitable for growing potato. And so when this blight occurred, we consequently had nothing to survive on, because the Brits had taken our land and made it impossible for us to survive on anything else. you know. And there was a number of penal laws that were brought in to just completely dispossess us, to disenfranchise us. You know, there was no inheritance possible. It was a total disaster. It was like it was written up by Satan himself, these penal laws. And whenever this question about the famine comes up, there's always the question of intentionality, because, you know, if you want to label something a genocide, then you need to talk about intentionality. Okay, imperialist apologists bend over backwards to say, oh, well, you know, we didn't mean for that to happen. We didn't want that to happen. It just sort of happened. You know, there was a potato blight. Get over it. But yeah, there were potato blights all over the United Kingdom at that time. There were potato blights in England. There were potato blights in Wales. There were potato blights in Scotland, all over Europe, and none of them, none of them caused this genocidal famine, because when they happened, the British government stepped in and diverted food and resources to those places that were missing food and resources, and they saved the people. You know, this was reflected in the politics of the time. You could hear people talking about this. You can really hear the genocidal intentions when you listen to what the politicians of the time were actually saying. You know, the colonial administrator of this time, Charles Trevelyan, he described the famine, and his words are that it was an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population. Okay, so the native Irish were that surplus population. We were too much, didn't want us, just let's just reduce that population, which means get rid of them, slaughter them, let them die, you know. The new Chancellor, Sir Charles Wood, stated at the time that, except through a purgatory of misery and starvation, I cannot see how Ireland is to emerge into anything approaching either to quiet or prosperity. So again, he sees a purgatory of misery and starvation as necessary for Ireland to be in any way redeemed. For no other reason, by the way, than the fact that we were portrayed as this kind of lesser, inferior race. Again, part of the colonial ideology, you know. Lord Courtenay, during a British parliamentary debate on the situation in 1847, so this is smack bang in the middle of the famine itself, of this period, he made the situation very clear when he stated that there were 2 or 3 million people in Ireland who, if not employed or relieved, must starve. Okay, and as a result of British colonial policy directly, we did starve, 1 million of us. Okay, and a further 1 million were forced to leave the country. So these are just some of the examples of the horrors inflicted upon the Irish by the English, then later British and UK ruling classes. But always at its core, it's the English. I'd never place blame on, for example, like the Scottish or the Welsh or anything like that for any of these things. It is the English ruling classes who have been in direct contradiction, in an antagonistic contradiction with the Irish people for over 800 years.
Your answer was very, very sad. I would like to continue this subject. Do you think that because for me, when I ask you about Ireland, I wanted to ask about the capitalism system. That there is a myth that when one country became capitalism, sooner or later everybody will be rich and the country will be very, very prosperous. And but this chapter in Capital about Ireland, it's shown that the power of England, for creating the power of England, was necessary to destroying the peasants in England, but also destroying the Ireland. So it is one process that in the same time that one country became rich because this country have colony, and this colony, because of capitalism, became poor. And the capitalism in Ireland, it is something which give you the starvation of 1 million people. Do you think that the processes which was in in Eastern Europe countries after the contre-revolution, that they destroyed our economy, they make the reduction of our population, also a lot of immigration, especially from Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania. They came to England, to London, or to Western Europe to work, but the creation of capitalism in our country was a destruction of the economy which existed before. So always the capitalism, for starting, have to destroy something which existing before, to make people starve, to make people poor and desperate to emigrate, or working for very very poor condition.
Yeah, it's interesting. I sometimes feel it's a little bit unfair how much Marx and Engels spoke about Ireland. It was very close to their hearts. I recall Engels wrote to Marx during a visit to Ireland in May 1856. So this was just a couple of years after the famine, and he stated that one can already notice here that the so-called liberty of English citizens is based on the oppression of the colonies. I've never seen so many gendarmes in any country, of military forces in one country. So he was already making that that point back then, and I do think that I think it's a question we're probably going to return to later when we start talking about like the global division of labor, where we're going to return to maybe super exploitation and how this really boosts up these countries in the imperial core and allows for capitalism imperialism eventually to flourish in these imperialist centers. So yeah, I would defer to you with regard to the economic situation in places like Poland and Eastern Europe and so on. I think these situations a lot better than I would, but definitely the semi-colonial status is very much there, and I suspect that these countries have gone through a very, very similar horrific, destructive experience, just like we had here in Ireland.
But the people in Ireland, they know history of this starvation, because one time when I spoke with one anti-communist idiot, and he made me example of Holodomor, I gave
Oh my
him
god.
example of the famine in Ireland, and he said that it is communist propaganda. So yes, because they didn't teach about this in Polish school. So if they teach about this in Irish school,
There's a little bit. We get taught a little bit of this in Ireland. A lot of our history is suppressed. Like, for example, the details that I went into with you with regard to the slaughtering of unarmed civilians, the genocides, the starvations, the scorched earth policies. They don't hear anything about that in public education. They can't. In fact, the public education system reflects the national bourgeoisie who took control in the counter-revolution following 1922 onwards. And they kind of wanted to create this idea that everything's okay in Ireland now. Let's just put that behind us. Let's pretend that we're one of these great advanced European powers. They sort of like to present themselves as though Ireland, somewhere like Dublin, is somewhere like Paris or like London, and like we're kind of part of this EU imperial core thing. But unfortunately, of course, when you look at the reality and you look at the economics of the situation and the real genuine material conditions, you realize that that's totally not true. So one of the things that what we call the Free State forces, the comprador class in charge, has done is that they've actually removed history as a mandatory subject from schools. So they don't teach the history. And if they do teach it, they teach it in a very, how can we say, sanitized fashion, And of course, with the legacy of colonialism, there's always going to be, how can I say, there still are remnants of people feeling a sense of subservience. So rather than listening to what, for example, Irish authors have written about these subjects, listening to what Irish people who were there wrote about these things, they will defer to, instead, they will listen to what somebody in London, somebody in some British scholar will say, some imperialist apologist will say instead about this. So for example, you hear Irish people often saying that, oh, well, it wasn't actually a genocide. It wasn't really a genocide. They didn't mean to. It happened, but they didn't mean to do it. It was like, oops, sorry. Like a 7-year process of watching all these people die. Meanwhile, at the same time, there's more than enough food to feed everybody in the country, and they sort of present it as though, well, it was just they were just kind of these benign idiots who didn't realize what they were doing. But of course, then when you look into it, you realize it was very clear that this was a genocidal colonial policy. So yeah, it's true that the education with regard to Irish history is very sanitized, very watered down. And also, I have to say, what you've mentioned with regard to anti-communism, there is a strain of anti-communism, a strong strain of anti-communism in Ireland. You know, communism is not something that people really identify with here at all, which is very strange because, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, like the 1916 Rising, at the heart of the 1916 Rising was, of course, a revolutionary Marxist, a scientific socialist in James Connolly, you know. So our entire country was kind of spearheaded by this communist figure. And but even in schools, when we learn about James Connolly, the way they present him in schools, when we're taught about him, they say that he was a good Catholic who just cared about the poor working classes, which couldn't be further from the truth. You know, it really couldn't. It's ridiculous. But this is how they try to pacify revolutionary socialists, you know, revolutionary communists. You know, they say rather than this being someone who was committed to scientific socialism and bringing about the end of colonialism in Ireland, who was committed to national liberation and socialist revolution, and he died fighting for that. He's pacified into just being a good Catholic, which is ridiculous, you know. So this pervades society. What I will say for the general Irish population, and to their credit, there is a pretty decent anti-imperialist sentiment among the people. There isn't a strong worker sentiment, you know, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. That's actually that's a reflection, a dialectical reflection of the fact that the principal contradiction within Ireland is imperialism and the oppressed nation, rather than the standard capitalist versus the proletarian class. We've never actually developed that kind of proletariat versus bourgeois forces. People often look at Irish politics, parliamentary politics, for example, and they think it's very strange that we don't have like a standard left-wing party and a standard right-wing party. Both are kind of centrist, you know. But what it actually was the two main parties that we had developing. One of them was anti-imperialist and one of them was pro-imperialist. One of them supported collaboration with England. That would be Fine Gael. One of them really wanted to work with them. And the other one would have been quite anti-imperialist. They wanted an independent, anti-imperialist Irish Republic. At least that's how it started, but they moved more and more towards the right as time went on. So that's what I will say. Irish people do. I mean, for example, if you look at earlier on the year with everything that happened with like Palestine, I believe more Irish people, you know, proportionately showed up in support of Palestine at Palestine protests, in support of the Palestinian people against the ongoing colonial occupation of Israel. So there is a general sentiment, a general anti-imperialist sentiment, although it needs to be refined, because obviously we're talking about imperialism in very kind of broad stroke senses here, in a very, I suppose, kind of in a very basic sense, you know, colonialism and stuff like that. We're not really talking about Lenin's capitalism, imperialism, and the highest state, you know, monopoly capitalism. So yeah, that's what I will say. There is an anti-communism there that needs to be addressed and dealt with, and we need to keep raising the working class's class consciousness. But yeah, what can I say? There are fools. There are fools here, and I don't mean to be too cruel about that, because they've been fooled. They've been fooled and misled by a comprador class who wants them to believe these things. You know, the people have been fooled. Unfortunately, they've been hoodwinked by a pro-imperialist comprador class under a bureaucrat capitalist regime, which currently leads the country, or at least leads the 26 counties in what's called the Free State, or the so-called Republic of Ireland.
The Polish politic is also divided, but we have two parties. One support the German imperialism, and second support American imperialism. So it is the politic in Poland. So you already answer about James Connolly. I wanted to
Oh,
ask
I can talk
same.
more. Actually, I can
Yes,
talk a
yes,
lot
yes,
more
yes.
if you'd like.
But wait. There
Mm.
is already two questions from the chat, but if there is a time, I will read it after my question, which I prepared. So it is the
Yeah.
message from the
Yeah.
comrade who are watching this.
Okay.
So recently, a discussion about patriotism has been taking place on the American YouTube. More specifically, can a communist be a patriot, and can the communist movement use a national flag? What do you think? Can you tell who James Connolly was? So you already said, but you can repeat more.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, so I think it's really important to look at it. It doesn't matter what I say about these things. What matters is that we're always looking towards what Marx and Engels and Lenin and Stalin and Mao and so on said about these things, and they were always quite keen to emphasize the difference between oppressor nations and oppressed nations. Some people don't like those terms, but those are the terms that Lenin himself used. And I think we mentioned this before we went live. There were a couple of countries where Engels specifically stated that in order to be an internationalist, a proletarian internationalist, you first had to be a nationalist. And he specifically singled out Ireland and Poland when he was writing in the 1800s. And the reason for this, the reason for this left-wing nationalism is national oppression. So that's the basis for it. The basis for it is national oppression and the fight to end it. So without national oppression, without a national liberation struggle, there's really no need for it. In this case, if there is no national oppression going on, then as Stalin said, the class conscious proletariat has its own tribe banner and has no need to rally to the banner of the bourgeoisie. However, in the colonies and semi-colonies, left-wing nationalism can play an important role in helping to resolve the global contradiction between imperialism and the oppressed nations. Now, I will also just add a little addendum there. As for the socialist countries themselves, countries that are actually socialists, well, they're no longer in the position of being exploiters, of being imperialists, of being oppressors. So yeah, there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to feel a sense of patriotic pride in what they've achieved in world historical terms for the working class and the oppressed masses. So yeah, those are my general thoughts, and I think we're more or less on the same page on this. Did you want to add some thoughts on that, or some opinions on that? It's a very hot topic at the moment. A lot of people are very fired up about it. Would you like to share any thoughts on that?
It is very difficult for me to say something about this because I am Paul. I came from Poland, but the most important discussion is where is Poland now? Because in the
Mm.
one way, Poland is a member of the NATO and participated in occupation of Iraq, of Afghanistan, and made a lot of bad things in the Eastern Europe, especially in Belarus, where the Poland tried to organize putsch against the President Lukashenko. And the Poland is the puppet of the American imperialism. And in this way, I am ashamed of the Polish government and the Polish soldiers who occupied Iraq and used the Polish national flag. I don't want to be with them. But in the second time, when you came to Poland, you will see that Poland is totally dependent. That the economy of Poland is the Western economy, Western corporations. The Polish
Mm.
politicians, they all only make orders from Brussels or from Washington. And the Polish people, our salaries in European Union are the smallest one in Europe. We have the American soldiers in Poland. So in one way, Poland is a occupied country, and we think about to using the Polish flag to make this movement against imperialism, against the participation in NATO, against the occupation Poland of the American soldiers. But the Polish nationalism now, I said now in 2021,
Mm.
is very reactionary nationalism. Because the nationalism which existed in Poland 100 years ago, in the time when Poland was in the partition, it was the revolutionary nationalism. In the time of the revolution 1905, the people make a struggle, they make strikes. In the time of the revolution, also they use the Polish national flag, and it was at that a time when the Marx and Lenin, they supported the movement for Polish independence, and Polish revolutionaries participated in the Commune of the Paris, in the struggle in many European cities in the time of the spring of the nation in 1848, and many Polish nationalists participated in the socialist revolutionary movement. So it is very complicated discussion that our nationalism before was progressive, today is reactionary. There is a reactionary, but they are also a people who try to how to say, this tradition of the progressive nationalism from 19th century
Mm.
make today, but
Okay,
with
to
this.
revive, yeah. They're trying to revive the old nationalism, that old really progressive socialist nationalism that was there before.
So when I ask you this question, it is a question for advice for me, because we have this discussion today in Poland in the
Mm.
comrade. If we have to use this flag or not, because there are good explanation for not using, and also good explanation for using, and this is the problem. So maybe you
Mm.
will advise us.
Well, it's it's not my place to tell you whether or not it's good. It sounds like there is a basis for progressive revolutionary nationalism there. Um, Within the Irish context, it's a lot easier. It's a much easier question because that revolutionary nationalist tradition, the Republican tradition, the anti-colonial tradition, it never ended. It's been continuous since 1798 with Wolfe Tone and the United Irishmen and their uprisings all throughout the 1800s, 1900s, and up to this very day. We have socialist Republicans fighting for a 32 county socialist republic, and they fly the tricolour, the Irish flag, but they also fly our own unique flag, the Starry Plough, which actually you can see that the little avatar that I have on there is the Starry Plough, which that's the flag of socialist republicanism in Ireland. The green flag with the yellow plough. The plough represents the peasants and the workers. There's a little sword on that as well. You might be able to see, which of course represents the sort of physical force tradition of fighting for this. It's always been a very radical fighting tradition. It's never been, a kind of reformist tradition. Unfortunately, revisionists have taken it that way, but that hasn't really been the Republican tradition. So it's a lot clearer cut in Ireland because it generally is. There's a small number of right-wing nationalists, extremely reactionary nationalists in Ireland. There's a for example a party called the National Party at the moment who are trying to co-opt the Republican struggle in Ireland, the national liberation struggle in Ireland. They're trying to take these figures like James Connolly and turn them into like fascist icons or something like this. It's really crazy, but nobody buys it. Nobody, everybody thinks it's ridiculous. Everybody thinks it's just silly. Get out of here. They get laughed out of every place they enter. People throw milkshakes on them. They splash the flash, as they say, and so it hasn't been successful. There has never been a successful development of a genuine right-wing nationalism in Ireland. There has been a kind of a centrist, middle-class nationalism, but certainly we don't have that kind of nasty, really reactionary, fascistic nationalism in any kind of really dominant force in Ireland. Just a couple of individuals, I suppose. So it's easier for me, if you had those same conditions in Poland, then yeah, you should absolutely embrace the national struggle. But it's really going to depend on the workers' consciousness. Is flying the flag in Poland today, is that falling into the trap of tailism? Is that tailing behind reactionary sections, or is that leading the masses towards national liberation? I think I remember you saying something quite interesting in your videos, and I think there might be some basis for national liberation in Poland when you said you made an interesting point. You spoke about Lidl and many of these different companies, these transnational and multinational corporations that are in Poland, and none of them actually are Polish. None of them belong to Polish people. So that means when we consider the traditional pathway to socialism, the workers seizing the means of production, seize the means of production. Well, who are you seizing the means of production from? It's probably not a Polish bourgeoisie. It's probably American or German bourgeoisie, imperialist forces. So there may be some basis for a national liberation kind of movement there. And I think that you probably need to do some campaigns to raise awareness of that, to let people know that this is what we mean when we're talking about those things, um, because that's what it means in Ireland. We see in Ireland the national struggle and the class struggle, they're one and the same. They're the same thing. You cannot separate them. And that was, I can actually segue into James Connolly and to talk a little bit about that. Maybe that'll be helpful. Would you like me to talk a little bit more about James Connolly's positions on this? Because he was, of
Yes, yes,
course.
yes, of course.
Okay, so I'll give a little bit of context, and then we can dive into this question a little bit more. So James Connolly, he was a revolutionary Marxist and just a really great example of a left-wing revolutionary nationalist. Again, this nationalism of the oppressed and colonized nation against imperialism. So he applied scientific socialism to the particular conditions of Ireland, and he combined it with the revolutionary left-wing anti-colonial Irish Republican movements. And in doing so, Connolly synthesized what's called socialist republicanism, which is the guiding thought of the Irish revolutionary movement to this day, to today. And this, of course, happened with the founding of his Irish Socialist Republican Party in 1896. And when he was doing this, when he was combining the two of these, he was very much anticipating what Chairman Mao Zedong would later state when he said that in the final analysis, national struggle is a matter of class struggle. So, in other words, in the Irish context, we need to understand that the principal contradiction in Ireland is between imperialism and the oppressed nation. So the question of national liberation and socialist revolution in this context are inseparable. Now, in material terms, this means that our struggle to seize the means of production, distribution, and exchange, all of the wealth and wealth-producing processes across the 32 counties of this country, necessarily means seizure from the foreign imperialist powers primarily, and then our own native exploiting class secondarily. That's kind of like a secondary thing, And so that's the combination that we have of the national struggle and the class struggle, because you can't have one without the other. It's all well and good to say, let's do national liberation and forget about class struggle. But of course, when all of these foreign companies are still in the country, they're still going to be extracting wealth and looting and pillaging and sending all of the resources abroad. So it's not national liberation at all. At the other side of the spectrum, if we just look at it on a national level and we just look at the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, we're really missing something, because we can't seize the means of production, distribution, and exchange from the Irish bourgeoisie, because the Irish bourgeoisie isn't the dominant force. The dominant forces are the forces of imperialism, and in Ireland, those forces are North American imperialism, both the US and Canada, and also European imperialism, French, German, a couple of others, and then, of course, primarily the big one is British imperialism. So when we talk about this class struggle, it has to include the two. You cannot separate them. It's impossible to separate them. And I wonder if it might be similar. If it might be a similar situation in Poland. What do you think?
In Poland, we have different history than Ireland, and so when you started saying about all the history when the British killed the Irish people in the time of Cromwell and before and later, Poland in the 17th century make the same thing in the Ukraine. The Polish feudal came to Ukraine and killed a lot of Ukrainians, and Ukraine was something like the Polish colony in this time. So
Okay.
it is first thing why the Polish nationalism is reactionary, because a lot of people are proud about this, that we also are the and our great history where when Poland Polish king could make a battle against I don't know peasants and kill them. Second thing, it is the history from the 20th century, and the neighbor of Poland was the Soviet Union. So the most progressive state in the world was a
Mm.
neighbor of Poland, and also there was two wars or three wars between Poland and Soviet Union. First was in 1920, second was in the 1939, and third was the time when the socialism was built in Poland, and there we had the anti-communist terrorist organization which attacked the socialist state and also the soldiers of the Soviet army which are in Poland in this time. So it is the problem how we communists can use the example of patriotism, which when the one of the most important thing for the Polish patriotism now is that there was a time when we have battle with Soviets and we killed them, or they kill, or all the time they said that communism it is anti-Polish, really anti-Polish ideology, and the communists killed a lot of Poles and stuff like this. So this is the things which don't exist in Ireland, and I
Mm.
think that it's not comparable. This question which is comparable is it's the economy today. That Polish economy is everybody who looked at the economy of the European Union, he see how it's worked, that we have the Eastern European countries where is the cheap labor, and there is the localization of production, which the factories from France, from other countries go to Poland, go to Romania, and because of the cheap labor and the economic exploitation of the Poles today is something real. When you see the Polish truck drivers in all the Europe, they are living like slaves. They are sleeping in the trucks 3 weeks, 4 weeks without shower, without in the time of the epidemic they don't have shower because they sleep in the trucks. So the Poland now, this is the nation of the slaves in the European Union, who have to make the very hard work, physical work for very cheap for very cheap wages. But the problem is how to explain to the Polish society that you are exploited, you have to be leftist, you have to using the patriotic ideas to fight with imperialism, not to fight with Russia, to fight with migrants, not to fight with the Muslims and stuff like this, because when you see, for example, in 11 November in Poland, you have very, very big demonstration of nationalists. It is this year. It was 150,000 people. They march in Warsaw, and what they shout there? They shout, "We are against migrants. We are against communists." You don't have communists in Poland, but they all the time hate communists, and they are crazy. And nobody shout, "U.S. Army, get out." Uh, Sometimes they shout. Uh, there are some people who shout something about against Germans.
Mm.
But it is something that never against United States, and there is no question of the nationalization of the property of the Western companies, because they say, "Oh no, no, it is socialism, and socialism is bad." So But you have to came
Yeah.
to Poland because they are very it is there are very complicated people that they you can use the argument, but they don't listen you.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, it doesn't sound good from what you explained. It doesn't sound like it would be a very good idea to go out and start waving the flag and all this. But I suppose maybe just a neutral, I guess, a neutral position is on this. Maybe don't go, doing this thing like burning the flag or like anti-patriotism or something like this. You don't need to take such an extreme level, but there is the basis for some kind of progressive patriotism there, but unfortunately at the moment it seems like the dominant strand, the principal aspect is of course that it's very reactionary, that it's extremely reactionary, and on that basis it might be better to organize around the working class issues, specifically around imperialism and all of these kinds of things, and maybe leave the question of patriotism for a later stage in the development of the movement. When, as you say, when the Polish people return to socialism and to communism, and when they're participating in these movements, maybe that's not going to be tomorrow. Maybe that's not going to be next year. Maybe that's going to be 10 years, 20 years. The name of your channel, Rebirth of Communism, where we have to build everything again. It's a long bend in the road, but we also have to be revolutionary optimists and realize that we will get back to that. We will return in the future. People will not always be manipulated by the international class of capitalist imperialists, and maybe at that stage, when things change, when the workers start becoming a class into themselves, then we can start to embrace patriotism in these contexts again.
The problem is that now in Poland you can be neutral about this. I don't know if you heard about the situation in the Polish-Belarusian border, but there are the migrant crisis, and the Polish border guards are killing the migrants from Iraq, from Afghanistan. They are using water and tear gas against people in the where you have the temperature or 0 degree. Already there are I think that 15 people who died there, but it is only officially resulted, not officially is many more. And every day they speak that now we are in war, that we are attacked by the Belarus and by the migrants. So we have this nationalist hysteria today. So we can't be neutral. We have to make our position. But do you want that I read the question from the chat, or because now there are many questions for you, or continue with
Well,
my question?
I'm looking at the time. I've got about
No.
15 to 20 minutes left, and
Okay.
then I need
Okay,
to
so
go. So maybe
maybe I will read a question from chat, and you will, if you want to answer, or you can answer. If not,
okay,
I will. But so I will start. Jota Z1. How was Northern Ireland created?
great
The
one.
Spectator. How many people with communist views in Ireland? Matt J, I would like to know your both takes on Rittenhouse case. Please don't give this about distraction, please. Green Skydiver, does Paul have any experience with people who claim to be victims of communists? Milling, we US has succeeded in buying Lithuania's loyalty with 600 million for its extreme anti-China stance. What other NATO members do you think are likely to follow the footsteps of Lithuania? Vox Populi Spartacus. Comrade Paul, what do you think of the socialist Republican paramilitaries like the OIRA, INLA, etc. Is that still the relevant strategy for freeing Northern Ireland today? The spectators, what does Paul really think about Stalin Trotsky power struggle?
I gotta
The
take it
question
to.
of Stalin Trotsky is always in every
Oh
conversation.
man! All right, don't make me. Okay, you can't see me, but I'm holding a pickaxe right now.
Mm.
Okay, that was a lot of questions, and I don't think I'm going to get to them all. It started off with a great question about how was Northern Ireland created. Northern Ireland was created through a process known as gerrymandering. It was basically a land grab because there was this revolutionary upsurge after like the 1916 Rising, and there was a revolutionary upsurge all across Ireland. In 1918, we had declared the Irish Republic, which was actually the only time in the history of Ireland when there was a democratic vote put to all of the people together, the entire Irish nation across the 32 counties, and they produced a document from that called the Democratic Programme of the First Dáil, Éireann. The First Dáil is like our parliament, our revolutionary parliament, and it functioned as a dual power structure outside of the standard British one. And so we had this revolutionary Irish Republic. It was a People's Republic. You should read. I really recommend that people sit down and read the first program, the democratic program of the First Dáil Éireann, and you'll see like it pledges to the international workers' movement. It talks about taking control of the means of production, distribution, and exchange of the country, all of its wealth and wealth-producing processes. So it's a very socialistic document, and the Irish Republic itself could be described as very much a people's republic, a socialistic republic, and very, very much working class led. But of course, that was defeated in a violent counter-revolution in 1922 when the treaty, the pro-treaty forces, the national bourgeoisie betrayed everybody and made a deal with England, with Britain, to basically sacrifice the 6 counties in the north of Ireland. When we think about Ireland, we think about, in popular sort of international language, you hear about Republic of Ireland and you hear about Northern Ireland. Now, I think it's very important when we talk about Northern Ireland, there is no basis to call this Northern Ireland. The northernmost point, the highest point north in Ireland, is actually part of the Republic of Ireland. So that's technically like Southern Ireland if you're going by those terms. What it is, it's 6 counties in the northeast of Ireland, and the reason they chose those 6 counties was because historically in the 1600s there was what was called the Ulster Plantation, where they sent over many settlers from England and from Scotland in particular, and it was a very successful plantation. They displaced the native people, and this maintained throughout the ages, where in other parts of the country it didn't really maintain. A lot of people would have assimilated to Ireland. But so you have this settler population and their descendants, and they often find themselves loyal to the United Kingdom. They call themselves unionists, or the more extreme forms would be loyalists. Okay, and loyalists are most generally known as being this fascistic paramilitary forces that really defend empire in Ireland. And so basically, what England did, what Britain did, was they carved up Ireland. They did that. We don't talk about the Irish border in Ireland. We talk about the British border. The Brits carved up Ireland. Nobody in the 26 counties voted for that. Nobody in the 26 counties wanted that. And also nobody in the 6 counties wanted that. Okay. But the reason they did this, the reason that they took those particular 6 counties, was because the majority of people living in those counties could be guaranteed, they believed, could be guaranteed to hold and maintain their colonial power indefinitely. So it was more than 2/3 of the population that lived there were Protestants. They were loyal to the UK because they'd been given all this land and all these privileges and benefits, and so they created what we call the Orange State, this sectarian orange state. They called it a Protestant state for a Protestant people. And again, when we talk about Protestantism, we're not actually talking about religion. That's a red herring. We're actually talking about for colonizers and their descendants, for settlers. In Ireland, we generally call them planters because they come over on the plantations. And of course, it was a horrific carnival of reaction, both north and south of the British border in Ireland. But basically, the 6 counties, the occupied 6 counties, the part of Ireland that continues to be colonised to this day and occupied by British military forces, is a result of gerrymandering and literally carving up the country to maintain colonialism indefinitely. So that's the reason why that happened. Now, some other questions that were there. How many people in Ireland are communists? As I mentioned earlier, communism isn't really popular. In Ireland, we talk about socialist republicanism, and that's when you talk when you talk about republicanism in Ireland, you're talking about the Irish Republic that was proclaimed first in the 1916 Rising, and then actually established in 1918, and with that democratic program in 1919. So when you call yourself an Irish Republican, that's what you're upholding and pledging your allegiance to. And again, that's the People's Irish Republic, that very socialistic republic that existed, and that has almost that has the vast majority of support in the working class of Ireland, and also some of the middle classes as well. We don't really have like a national bourgeoisie in Ireland, but it's widely appreciated and widely enjoyed. As for communism itself, as a term, what the socialist republican organizations would be like on the international stage, they would be part of the communist movement. All of these revolutionary socialist republican organizations are either Marxist-Leninist or Marxist-Leninist Maoist or whatever it might be, but just in Ireland, the necessity was to merge both the social and the national question. And so that's synthesized within the guiding thought of socialist republicanism, and so that's what people call it. So if we use that term, socialist republicanism, then it has a huge amount of support. If we use the term communism, people are just going to look at you like like you're crazy. They're going to say, what are you talking about? But it's in essence, it's the same thing, if not in form. I think someone said something about extreme anti-China sentiment. I don't have any extreme anti-China sentiment at all. I do recognize that monopoly capitalism exists, but I actually would really strongly oppose anybody who attacks China from the right. Especially people who would come at it and talk about like Uyghur genocide and all that sort of stuff. I absolutely support the right to self-determination, and I totally oppose balkanization and all that sort of stuff. So I think that's a little bit of a mischaracterization to say that I'm extremely anti-China in any way. As for revolutionary socialist republican organizations engaging in armed activities, there was another question about the OIRA, the official IRA, the Irish National Liberation Army, etc. They never went away. They're still going, and other revolutionary physical force socialist republicans are still engaged in armed activity to this day. And look, if you're a revolutionary, then you got to do revolution. Unfortunately, we know that socialism is never going to come through the ballot box. It never successfully has, and it never successfully will. So that's probably the extent to what I can say to that on that question, without getting in any legal trouble, I suppose. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I missed any other questions there, but those are the ones that I remembered off the top of my head. Were there any other questions that you wanted to, or any comments?
So how many time you have? Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, I can do like 5 to 10 minutes more, and then we'll finish.
Okay, so I would like to ask about your channel and strategy for the future. What do you think the relationship should be between the creators of Marxist content, who have thousands of viewers, and the traditional communist parties? In your opinion, is the party building theory found in Lenin what have to be done to build parties? Do you want to join any existing party? Do you have any other strategy? For my part, I want to say that a year ago we decided to build the Polish Workers' Party from the viewers of our channel and Polish channel Odrodzenie Komunizmu. And unfortunately, this attempt was not successful. Instead, of a mass party, a small organization was formed. What are your plans?
Okay, this is a complicated question. I congratulate you on your efforts, and it's great that you're attempting these new ways, because this is a new avenue for everybody in terms of organizing politically, and we have seen successes. The right wing, the right wing fascists, reactionaries have really used these platforms in ways that have really drummed up a lot of support. Um, but we have different obstacles in front of us. So from the very start, I want to highlight that everything we say here is monitored by state forces as well as reactionaries. For this reason, we really need to be quite careful when we're discussing like strategy and stuff like that. So, I believe you've had experiences of repression by the Polish state, taken in by the police and stuff. Well, the Free State forces in Ireland, the Irish state, so-called Republic of Ireland state forces, are also similarly repressive, and they hold numerous political prisoners across the country. So for this reason, I don't discuss in real life political organizing anymore. I used to. I think quite naively, I used to speak extremely openly about my political activity, including with the Communist Party of Ireland, and also around that time when it disaffiliated from its previously its youth wing, the Connolly youth movements. Um, what I can say, is that by openly discussing my online political activity, and this is probably the positive aspect, in particular doing interviews with organizations like the Connolly Youth Movement, a number of people, quite a few people, became very interested in the organization, and they subsequently joined us as a result of that. So there is some potential for recruitment with what we're doing here. But you also need to be very careful, because really when you're doing this, especially like if you're putting like your face out there and your name and all of these things, it puts a target on your back when you engage in these activities, not only from state forces, but also from fascists, because they all know who you're with. They're going to be able to track you down very easily whenever there's some kind of political event. If you openly advertise that there's a political event and they know you're in this organization, they can very easily track you down, And so it makes things very, very difficult. And we need to be very careful and take this kind of stuff very seriously. Which is something that I really try to emphasize to people, because people just don't really realize the negative implications and consequences that this can have, So I'd really caution that anyone who's watching this should really think very deeply about how this might negatively impact either yourself or your organizations before committing to engaging in this kind of activity. Now, I'd also, excuse me, caution that I have is that these kinds of platforms are generally quite individualistic, and they can build up individual personas and egos when that's not really what we want as communists, as collectivists, And this building up of these individual personalities, these so-called influencers, as they're called, this can have a profound undermining of democracy and democratic centralism within organizations. As you're going to find all of these lone wolf communist creators with large amounts of influence online, and they're going to be speaking on behalf of an organization without ever having been democratically elected to be a representative spokesperson of that organization. And so this can influence the public's perception of the organization in all kinds of ways that are beyond democratic control by the organization. So, this is something to keep in mind. And there are ways around that. For example, the organization itself might actually democratically elect certain people to be kind of public facing figures for the movements. And that might be one way around it, but these are the kinds of considerations you really need to have with regard to these things. So, with that being said, we have to recognize that there really is a lot of potential for raising class consciousness with these new social media tools. And I do think that that's the principal benefits. I think that education is the best thing that we can use these platforms for. Like what you're doing here, you're educating people about various topics and various struggles from all over the world, So education is a very useful thing that we can do here. Secondarily, beyond that, I would say that there's also the possibility for some level of recruitment into organizations. However, if we were to consider what Chairman Mao would call the three magic weapons of revolution, and let's just focus on the party and the sort of United Front mass organizations, there is the possibility to raise awareness and encourage people to join the above ground mass organizations. Excuse me. One example of how that might function would be you might do interviews. You might do perhaps like an interviews with people from these legal above ground mass organizations. And then these guests or representatives of these organizations who you're interviewing could perhaps let viewers know how they might get involved in that movement. So that's one way of doing it without implicating yourself and getting yourself in any trouble, because people don't necessarily know whether you're part of this movement or that movement, and it can also be useful in that regard to get many people on from many different organizations that you are somewhat aligned with. Not necessarily, it might not necessarily be your organization, but it might be other organizations with whom you're pretty much on the same page with. And that can also just help to protect you, in terms of state forces and fascist forces and stuff like that. So, look, that's just one way. There are loads of other ways to get around these issues with security, but it is something that we need to take seriously. Now, as for this question with like Lenin and what is to be done and whether it's possible to build an organization primarily through online activity, I got to say I'm quite negative. I really believe that it isn't possible to purely build it online. The way, from doing this for a few years, what I see as the best thing we can do is online activity like this amplifies the real action that's taking place on the ground. If there's nothing happening on the ground, then there's nothing to amplify. There's nothing to promote. You know what I mean? So that's the general role. Those are the general sort of roles I would see social media as playing. First, that it's a very effective educational resource, which, I can't overstate how important that is for people to be able to access Marxist education on all kinds of different topics, which they otherwise might not be able to, access. And secondly, I think it's got a very important role in amplifying a revolution, amplifying revolutionary movements. It's not a substitute for a revolution. It's definitely not a substitute for revolutionary activity and building a movement on the ground, but it can also really help to amplify that, if that makes sense. And hopefully then this amplification would help to encourage membership of the organizations that are being highlighted, which has the knock-on effect of encouraging organizational recruitment. So in that kind of peripheral way, it can be a way of encouraging membership of the organization. Those are my experiences, and I've tried a couple of different ways of doing things with the channel and stuff. Those are the kind of main takeaways that I have from doing this for a few years. But what do you think? What are your thoughts? What has worked for you? What are your successes? What do you think are the limitations? And what are your experiences that we can all learn from and build upon?
I am agree with you with this question of that somebody who are public person in the YouTube could make his life in danger. I am living in France. I don't know. You know this that I immigrant. So for me, it was something very easy because I risk nothing. I am here in France, where you have a lot of communist parties or so-called communist parties. In this election, you have 4 candidates who called themselves communists. So here I can talk legally about the communism. I can talk about the building party in Poland, and I risk nothing. But I know that the situation in Poland is quite different. When I was in Poland in July, I was arrested because I was arrested, and it was very serious things because I was arrested by the Polish police politic. It is organization which normally are against the agents of our other states or terrorists or stuff like this, and they arrest me like a YouTube content creator who say something about communism, which I have support not thousands of millions of Poles. We are very but there is also the problem of the fascist organization. There are a lot of comment in my videos. We will kill you. We will kill your wife. We will kill your baby. And now I am a father also. So I am. It's good that I tried that I make this try to build organization, because before this I was now I think that I was a little naive, that there was a lot of comment, you have popular content, you have to say that build the party, we are waiting for you, build the party. And I was a little naive that I thought that when I wrote the manifest of the party, there will be in one day we will build the party with 300 people. So it was naive. It's good that we make this effort, and also the relatively aware that we are it was not finished with success. It is also good because now we have more experience how to build party, and our party was attacked 3 times very seriously by the provocators who joined the party using the anonymity of the internet, because we had the conversation only in internet. And after they starting to publish our conversation, what we are talking about the other people, and it provoked a lot of problems. So I am agree with you that the educational content in the YouTube, it is one thing. With this, there is no problem. But how to organize people? Now I can say that the YouTube is not the best way. That we need to use this tool, traditional tool, which existed 100 years ago in the time of the Bolshevik party. But it's difficult because the society is changed. In the 100 years ago, for example, people read the newspapers. Now in Poland the workers are illiterate. They don't read the newspapers. They sometimes, if they read something, it is articles, and very short articles. They read only the headlines. So this is the complicated question, and I don't know answer. It is why I ask you. But I am very ashamed. For one time I spoke here with the Vijay Prashad from India, and when he told about the activity of the communist parties of Marxists in India, which have 1 million members, and this party can organize the strike of the peasants, farmers in India, which participated 250 millions of people in one day. All this discussion about that we have organization for few people, it's a little I don't know. I think that one time I have to go to India and watch what how they work, because they they are successful in building mass movement which is controlled by the communists. And and they are not using YouTube like the most important tool.
Yeah, I agree. It really is. It's getting back to basics in many ways. Just getting out into the workplaces and talking to the workers and unionizing, and instilling class consciousness, and actually getting out into communities, knocking on doors, talking to people. It's joining local tenants unions, community tenants unions, stuff like that. Organizing around those kinds of issues, empowering the working class. And again, there is an opportunity to amplify those actions and those activities using online media and social media, but ultimately there needs to be something there to amplify. If there isn't, then we're probably just opening ourselves up to, as you said, provocateurs and all kinds of, well, we don't even know, maybe like state provocateurs, or maybe just like trolls, reactionary trolls online, all this kinds of stuff. And it's probably not going to get very far. Actually, one thing you said, you mentioned the newspapers and how people don't read. Actually, I do think that these kinds of videos and things on YouTube are a pretty good substitute for stuff like that, you mentioned, for example, doing the audiobook of Capital, by Marxist Capital. A lot of people really struggle to sit down and actually read through Capital volumes 1 to 3. A lot of people really struggle with that. But when people do audiobooks and people make audiobooks and people discuss these things online, that can be very, very helpful. And even when we talk about education, there can be two aspects to education. There can be theoretical education, and then there can be practical education in terms of what's actually happening right now. More like, really, but communist news coming from a proletarian working class perspective. So there's a lot we can do, but it's not a substitute. We also need to do. We do need to go back to Lenin.
Yes, I would
Build a
like to
party.
say one more thing, that I
Yeah.
participated in group like this in Paris. There is the organization, which is the section of the Italian organization named Lotta Comunista, and they have section in Paris, and they called Internationalist. And few months I was very close with them, not because political question, because I am not agree with them of the analysis of the Soviet Union, but because they are organizers. And also I participate in the going from door to door, and it was something that we are going to the building. They have the code for the door, so we can go to the knock to all the doors, and it was, good morning, we are communists, we sell newspapers. And for me it was something very, very strange, and I laugh about this, that it's very complicated, that you knock the door, somebody is open the door, and he started, and they are all wearing suits. And good morning, hi, we are communists and we have newspapers. But after few years, I starting to think that maybe this strategy is not so stupid, like
Yep.
for but it's very, very, also it is very complicated, because you don't know, you never know who will open the door.
Yep. They could be a reactionary. It could be
Yes.
dangerous. It could be kids. I mean, it could be all kinds of people. So it can be difficult. It's especially difficult if you are trying to sell something, like with a newspaper. That's very difficult because they almost see you like a salesperson or something like that. If you're not trying to sell something, if you're knocking on doors, in order to get people to attend, for example, a protest or a rally or a march or something, people are usually a little bit better, more like receptive. But I know what you mean. It's a very uncomfortable experience at the start and stuff. But you can also you can have some fun in there as well, and you can make good connections and build real mass bases by doing, or at least starting to, by doing stuff like that. So yeah, I think we need to get back to basics.
Okay, so thank you, comrades, for your time. I hope that the question which I didn't ask today, maybe it will be possibility to ask you at another time. It was
Definitely.
very, very a lot of things. You said a lot of things to thinking to me and our comrades to analyze. So your our conversation will be analyzed by the members of our party, and maybe we'll change something.
Okay, great. Well, hopefully in a positive way, and hopefully it wasn't too disruptive or anything. Thank you very much for having me on, comrade. I really appreciate this, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. And red salute from Ireland to you, and also to the listeners and viewers. Cheers, comrades. All the best.